Okay, amazing. You can do a practice introduction and then we'll start up for real.
Okay. Do I welcome you to the Holburne?
Why not? Okay, I'll welcome you to the Holburne. Seeing as, yep, just remind me of your name.
We're here with Alberta Whittle, discussing your exhibition here at the Holburne. So yeah, how have you sort of looked into the Holburne's history and its colonial past, and how has that influenced the work that we see here today?
The research has been a really big part of my thinking process. When I was invited to do this exhibition by Will Cooper, my lovely curator, he shared this plantation ledger that was part of their collection, which had largely not really been highlighted as part of their exhibition displays. And the curious thing about this plantation ledger is that the pages have been entirely sliced out. And we had a lot of conversations. There was also a really wonderful researcher, Jill, who was part of that process in trying to figure out why these plantation pages were erased. And there's been really nothing that conclusive, because plantation ledgers are really part of the archive of a working plantation. They have really important information. So they'll have some, scientific information, like literally the amount of rainfall or the quality of the soil, but they'll also have the names and ages and sexes of enslaved people working on the plantation. So they really span this almost, it becomes a really racialized way of understanding land and power and labor. And we were really curious about the people who we could find that information about who worked on the plantation. And it became almost a way of uncovering this past, but thinking about also the lives of people who've been lost in terms of their names, their agency, and really trying to find a way to kind of almost inject some life force into the names we could find. And so in this exhibition, at the beginning we started with thinking about an epitaph for people who died on the plantation. At the time we didn't really, have that much information. So I found myself, I was actually back home in Barbados at the time, really thinking about its proximity to me, but also my own genealogical proximity to these ideas of enslavement and power. The parish I grew up in is the same parish where the Paul's plantation stands, and it became a really emotional investigation, I guess, into how do we memorialize people whose names we don't have, who are numbers, really, because that is the information you can find in different archives, but the names are really few. And so that began the process. And then when we started thinking more about the shape the installation would take, I really found myself gravitating towards thinking about almost encapsulating these figures as spectral figures, but also to think about ideas of reanimation and the Caribbean Gothic. So thinking of history as a haunting, thinking about how do we give life force to these lost plantation memories. And so the limbo, which is, it's normally pictured as being quite kind of like fun, dance, you see it at any plantation, kind of display, or in various hotels in the Caribbean, and how that has become this way to normalize kind of racial distinctions of power. But for me, the limbo also has this deeper history, because I've researched Kamal Brathwaite's work, and he speaks of the limbo being birthed on a slave ship. And so it has this much darker history, although it appears in these much more palatable ways. And so I wanted to really almost create space to understand this movement as being a way to think of maneuvering, the literal maneuvering that people of colour have to undertake to survive, but also the maneuvering which, as a disabled body, I have to undertake to try and find and make space in the world today. So the limbo, it's simultaneously joyful, and for me it is a very joyful action, but it does have a deeper history. And so these figures are arranged almost in a spiral, and they could be actually kind of like arising into a standing position, or they could actually still be in that process of bending lower and lower and lower to maneuver. And, you know, as Will and I have been talking, the limbo sticks have almost become a bit like a guillotine in places, where they are presented over the neck. A lot of the work which I've been looking at over the past, you know, this time of research has been looking at abolitionary theories, so violence from the police and the state, and, you know, George Floyd's, you know, the kind of chanting which kind of emerged after, you know, during the Black Lives Matter process, you know, get your knee off my neck, that also feels really potent here.
And the limbo, there's like, like little stuff like the galleons and the hands, what they they're like the...
So they're cast hands?
Yes.
And I ended up painting them to kind of resemble like classic willowware or wedgwood, but each hand on the different figures has different motifs painted on it. So some of them are of a ship actually going down, or some of them actually kind of like have different imagery that we've taken from like maps. So like, you know, like a cloud blowing, but also images of conquest of from the Americas during the early days of the plantation economies.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to the slave book here, and I think it was around 150 pages that were torn out. And I know there's like the written works that are being installed around the city centre, so you're almost inviting these knowledges and like the torn out pages to be actualised in forms of accessibility, bringing that accessibility back into the public and making them aware of the Holburne's history and inviting this conversation to take place and to happen.
I'm really glad you brought up the posters because, you know, I found myself when I was walking around Bath really thinking about, you know, the kind of visibility.
Yeah.
You know, it's a space where the public space is designed to be seen. You know, we have all these wonderful grand promenades, there's the pleasure gardens behind the Holburne, and, you know, Bath in itself is a space where people would come to for rest, you know, or to take the waters.
Yeah.
And, you know, I really like the idea of speaking very directly to the public. And so when I started thinking about the images, I actually ended up writing quite a bit of poetry and writing this long poem, which is actually really, it kind of meanders and moves through instructions and also reminders of how the body can take on different presentations of freedom. And one of the spots where we're going to have one of the large images is actually on Walcott Street, and it's quite close to the Lady Mead building, which then we realised was also kind of at some point was turned into a penitentiary. And the Lady Mead building was a space for, Lady Mead Hospital I think, was a space for unwed mothers, but it also became almost like an asylum. And so it was this idea, because there was so much sex work happening in that part of the city, that any woman who was having sex out of wedlock and falling pregnant had to be insane, had to somehow be controlled. Her body had to be controlled, her body had to be criminalized. And that really struck me so much about how certain bodies aren't able to be considered free.
Yeah.
And the kind of power, the kind of like very misogynistic, but also racist narrative that goes with that. So a phrase which became really important to me is this idea, my body is electric, ungovernable. And so that's the poster which we have there. But also amongst the city, there are 4 different images which are on the different bus routes and also the train station, to also thinking about the moving in and around the city. But it is also kind of a reminder to the public to think about power, but also it is a reminder to rest, to be self-compassionate, to take care of oneself. I really love dance as a kind of medium in my work. I always think that dance was quite democratic. You know,
it can be.
It can be really democratic. And so it's also about thinking about that freedom of movement, you know, and for me the figures become this way to also think about joy. There's a lot of joy in these figures. There's also a lot of, for me they're quite potent, you know, in terms of like how they speak about different kind of traditions of masquerade. But also there's this idea of like water, you know, each of the different vessels has got some, you know, there's water from Bath, there's water from the Atlantic, I brought over from Barbados. There's also like this thing called Barber, which my grandma used to always bathe my face with when I got too hot. And there's very much a kind of feeling of carnival in the work as well. So carnival in the Caribbean kind of historically began as a day where the enslaved people would be free for a day. And so again, it speaks about like who is free, who gets to be free. But something which I'm really curious about happening in the exhibition is I've made these names out of clay. And you know, over time, because they aren't fired, they might degrade. And for me, again, that kind of speaks to the plantation ledger and how these names, you know, gradually have just been taken.
Materially with the papers and the written word, and how important it is just to, just not to rewrite it, but to...
It's about creating a fuller story.
Exactly.
You know, a phrase which Will and I have used a lot, which I use a lot when I think about more, is texture. And this is not just one story. You know, I think so often there's this expectation that, and also I think especially as a woman artist, that when you're making work which is serious, you yourself can't find space for joy. You know, that you are meant to be miserable, and you're meant to be really kind of like just one thing, one emotion. And for me, I really think taking joy is a very, it's a very radical act. You know, and so for me, this exhibition, like the film, you know, it really tries to make space for feelings of joy, for a bit of rest. I've really kind of thought very carefully around making sure there's spaces for people to reflect. You know, there's plenty of seating, so the audience can sit. If they want to sit on the floor, there are cushions for people to sit on the floor. And there are layers which, you know, audience members can take from it. If a bunch of school kids come in and they just find it really fun to see these limbo objects, and then they're curious about why is there that boat there that is maybe capsizing, or why is there this, then there's kind of scope for further conversation. But I think sometimes we underestimate our audiences, and we think they can't handle a difficult conversation, when really, I think they can. They can handle the layers of this, and hopefully also, you know, the posters become a way to also kind of like re-inscribe a bit of hope in them. Because I think the posters have that kind of layer of hopefulness in them.
Definitely. It is going back to that point of inviting people in this space, and like what you said about joy, inviting them to feel joy as well.
You know, and I think there's space for both. It's a difficult show in many ways because of the different subjects we're talking about, which I think, you know, many audience members won't have really, you know, kind of like tackled, or, you know, even thought when they came to the Holburne, this is what they'd be looking at, this is what they'd be thinking about. They might think, I'm coming to look at a beautiful collection of 18th century paintings, you know, and then there's something quite different here. But I trust the audience. I trust the audience implicitly that, you know, they can come in and handle a bit of discomfort, to come in and learn something different.
Because it is all about that learning experience, and especially not just here, like especially like going through the city, seeing the works there, seeing how it also relates to the Southwest and the slave trade that was so prevalent here. It just stays with you in that sense. Like when you leave, you are reminded of this. It's not just a fleeting moment that you're invited in this space and you leave and you go about your day is it sits with you, which I feel like is very important. And yeah. Great.
Do you want to do a practice
We can do
introduction?
I feel like if you just keep it running, we can.
I have just started it, so
Oh my god.
just to get to see what it looks like.
It's like we have a blooper reel at the end.
This is the behind the scenes, okay?
Yeah.